Hi, today I'm presenting the paper title of Calibrating the Mental Number Line. Human adults are thought to possess two dissociable systems to represent numbers. First is an approximate quantity system akin to a mental number line. The other is a verbal system capable of representing numbers exactly. In the present study, they investigate the interface between these two systems using an estimation task. Observers were asked to estimate the approximate numerosity of dot arrays. They show that, in the absence of calibration, estimates are largely inaccurate. Responses increase monotonically with numerosity, but underestimate the actual numerosity. In the first experiment, it consisted of non-calibrated estimation. In order to later evaluate the effects of calibration, they first studied how participants estimated the numerosity of the stimuli in the absence of any indication of number by the experimenter. In the first experiment, the instructions given ensure that participants will not be able to infer the range of numerosities presented. Here are some examples of stimuli of numerosity 9, 30, and 100 belonging to the three stimulus sets. The first stimulus set. Total occupied area and total luminance are constant. Thus, dot size decreases with numerosity and array density increases with numerosity. The second stimulus set. Total occupied area and dot size are constant. Total luminance and array density increase with numerosity. The third set. Array density and dot size are constant. Total luminance and total occupied area increase with numerosity. In the three sets, the mean dot size and mean total luminance are equal. Mean density is about twice larger in the third set, and total occupied area is about twice smaller in the third set. Participants were required to estimate the numerosity of the arrays. Responses were unrestricted. Since given a set of restricted responses will necessarily have provided information about the magnitude of the numbers involved, participants were instructed to provide a number that seemed the most adequate to them, both in terms of its magnitude and of its level of precision. Instructions did not include any numerical value. Participants typed their responses in arrow format on the numerical pad of the keyboard. The first experiment consisted of 5 French speakers. There are 3 males and 2 females, aged from 23 to 26. The figure shows the results of the 5 non-calibrated participants. The top row shows the distribution of the responses, using a gray color scale to represent the logarithm of the frequency of occurrence of the response R for each stimulus N. On the second and third lines, mean responses are presented, first on a linear plot and then on a log plot, where both horizontal and vertical axes have been log transformed. If the response functions are power-shaped as predicted in the theory part, they should appear as a straight line on a log plot. From the table of the mean stimulus numerosity leading to the response 30, we can see a considerable variability between participants in the amount of underestimation. In the magnitude estimation experiments, the shape of the response functions is generally a power function. To test whether this property is standard to the present dataset, they ran a regression analysis on the log transform data. If the response functions were power-shaped, then the log transform response function must be a linear function of the log transform numerosity. A slope of 1 in the log regression analysis will indicate that the responses were actually linear. Results reveal that the log regression fitted the data remarkably well. and the exponents were all significantly smaller than 1, indicating that responses were shaped as a power function and were not linear. Two separate analyses were completed to test for scalar variability in this data. First, for each participant, they computed the coefficient of variation for numerosities above 25 and submitted this to a linear regression with numerosity. The levels of fit were poor, indicating that CVs did not tend to vary with numerosity. Next, as a second more sensitive test of the straight linearity between standard errors and mean response, they used a log-log analysis. If scalar variability is verified, the logs of the standard error and of the mean estimates should form a straight line with a slope of 1. A slope different from 1 will indicate that the relation between the standard errors and the means is a more complex power function. However, the slopes were not significantly different from 1 for 4 out of the 5 participants. While scalar variability is not strictly verified in participant PQ, it still provides an adequate description of this data, since the coefficient of variation did not vary dramatically in this participant PQ. So, in general, the property of scalar variability gives an adequate description of this data, even if it's not strictly verified in one of these participants. The research recorded non-calibrated estimates in 5 participants of numerosities ranging from 1 to 100. For each participant, the responses displayed internal coherence, as they were increasing with numerosities. However, the actual numerosity of the stimuli was strongly underestimated. Participants differed from each other in how much they underestimated this stimuli. The estimates follow 2 classical laws of estimation experiments. First, responses functions were power-shaped, as in magnitude estimation experiments. Second, the variability of the responses follow the law of scalar variability within 4 out of 5 participants, which means that as numerosity increased, standard deviation of the responses increased proportionately to the mean response. In order to address these issues, they designed a second experiment where they presented participants with a reference array before they estimated numerosities. In the second experiment, it consisted of calibrated estimation. Some materials in experiment 1 was used in experiment 2. Different from experiment 1, they allow responses were restricted to a set of raw numbers only. This type of numbers corresponded to the most frequent responses produced by the participants in the first experiment. In order to check for possible effect of response instructions, they conducted an informal survey where 10 participants were presented with a single dot array containing 58 dots, in the same condition than in the first experiment. Expect that they were instructed to use only small numbers or decade numbers in their response. The experiment consisted of 2 sections. Before each block, participants were presented with a reference dot array and were told that it contained 30 dots, as known as the inducers. However, depending on the experimental condition, the inducer actually contained either 25 dots, 30 dots, or 39 dots. For the second session, participants who had seen overestimated or underestimated inducers were presented with exact inducers in the second part of the experiment. Among the participants who had seen exact inducers, half were assigned to the overestimated inducer condition, and the other half to the underestimated inducer condition. Thus, For half of the participants, the inducer presented in the second session was larger than in the first session, and for the other half, the inducer was smaller in the second session than in the first. Gender was balanced in all conditions. The participants in the second experiment consisted of 24 French speakers. There are 12 females and 12 males, aged from 19 to 33. The figures show the responses of the three groups of induced participants. All groups were presented with an inducer trial which they were told contained 30 dots. In the overestimated inducer group, the inducer contained 25 dots. In the exact inducer group, it contained 30 dots. In the underestimated inducer group, it contained 39 dots. After calibration, responses still increased monotonically with numerosity. Furthermore, induced participants adapted their responses quite accurately to the inducer trial. The difference between groups approached significance. All these distributions differ significantly from the much higher numerosity associated with the response 30 by the non-induced participants. The value of the inducer had an effect on the whole scale of numerosities presented, thus allowing us to reject the hypothesis of a local calibration. They grouped stimuli into 10 numerosity levels and ran an ANOVA analysis with factors of numerosity and inducer. Numerosity had a significant effect and interacted with inducer. Numerical responses grew more slowly in the large inducer condition. This effect was not restricted to the neighborhood of the inducer value, but extended to the whole scale even in the range 95 to 100. The responses were significantly smaller in the underestimated inducer group than in the overestimated inducer group. After the break, in the second experimental session, the participants readapted their responses to the new value of the inducer. For this analysis, they separated the participants in two groups, depending on whether the inducer presented in the second session was larger or smaller than the inducer of the first session. They ran an ANOVA analysis with factors of session, which means first and second, group and numerosity, with 10 levels as previously. Together with an effect of numerosity, we can observe an effect of the experimental session and an interaction between session and numerosity. These effects indicated that numerosities were overall more underestimated in the second session, particularly in the large numerosity range. More importantly, the interaction between group and session approached significance, and we also observe a strong triple interaction. The latter two effects indicate that participants readapted differently depending on the relative size of the first and second inducers. The participants for whom the second inducer was larger than the first one decreased their responses in the second session, particularly in the large numerosity range. Since the calibrated estimation test corresponded to a magnitude estimation experiment, estimates were expected to form a power function of numerosity. So they used a log-law regression analysis on the responses of each participant to test for the shape of the response functions. As in the first experiment, the regression fitted the responses remarkably well. Second, the variability of the responses was still scalar after calibration. As predicted, the standard deviation of the responses increased with the mean response, and the coefficient of variation was essentially constant. Data were submitted to the same analysis as for the non-calibrated participants. First, a linear regression was run between coefficient of variation and numerosity. The slopes of these linear fits were very close to zero. The level of fit was very poor in this regression, indicating a weak covariation between coefficient of variation and numerosity. Second, they use a low-low regression to estimate the relation between the standard deviation and the mean response. The slopes of the regressions were close to 1, though they departed significantly from 1 in the overestimated and excess-induced groups. In the underestimated group, however, it was not different from 1 and indicated strict scalar variability. So we can conclude that scalar variability is approximately but not always perfectly verified in the dataset. Finally, we verified that participants were basing their responses on the numerosity of the arrays, rather than on some non-numerical parameter, such as array density or dot size. The stimuli belong to 3 intermediate sets with different types of controls. Thus, if a participant was basing his responses on a single non-numerical parameter, his response would be flat in at least one of the 3 stimulus sets. On the contrary, we observe monotonically increasing responses in all of the 3 sets. For each participant, the slope of a linear regression between responses and numerosity was significantly higher than 0 within each set. The results rules out that the possibility that the observers were relying on a single low-level parameter. However, estimates produced for the stimuli belonging to the third set were smaller than for the other set, possibly because the average density or total occupied area differ in the third set compared to the other ones. It is possible that participants were using a complex combination of 2 or more parameters to extract numerosity. Indeed, such combination might be one way by which the visual system extracts approximate numerosity from visual displays. Participants underestimate in the absence of calibration, but adapt their estimation responses to the received indication, even though this indication is not accurate. The influence of the calibration is not restricted to the neighborhood of the calibrated numerosity, but extended to the whole range of numerosity tested. No matter with or without calibration, participants' behavior follows the psychophysical laws. The mean responses form a power function of numerosity, and the variability in the responses follow the law of scalar variability.